Kayla, welcome to Podcastina.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming here. I'm going to jump right in with you to a very complex question, but I think you're the perfect person to answer it. Does everyone have trauma?
Yes. Everyone has trauma. I think trauma needs like a rebrand because everyone thinks it's like, not everyone, a lot of people think it's, you have to have been, you know, in combat or experienced a brutal assault or something, huge, which of course those are traumas as well. But a trauma could also be like one comment that somebody made. We never know what's going to stick and what's not. There's so many factors, right? That's why two people can go into combat, but one might come out with PTSD and one might not. That's all. There's so much context, our histories, all of those things, just how we receive information in general. But yeah, trauma can be, it can be big, small, anything. What it really does is it creates or reinforces a belief about you. So I've worked with a lot of people that maybe like somebody with ADHD, especially if it was undiagnosed as a child. A lot of times they'll talk about um, maybe their teacher would give them a hard time for forgetting their homework or talking in class, or their parent did. Like, that can be trauma, and that often creates a belief in somebody that there's something wrong with me or I'm not good enough. And so the trauma is actually that belief. So it's not that the teacher said stop talking or you're talking too much. The trauma is, I now believe there's something wrong with me. So it's not necessarily the event, but it's the belief that it creates inside of you.
And I hear people speak about little t trauma versus big T trauma. And can you still have trauma even if it's not this catastrophic event, right? Like you don't go to war, you can still definitely be traumatized. What's the biological purpose of trauma?
Well, it's to protect us, right? Because what it does, trauma keeps us dysregulated, right? That's what a trigger does. It dysregulates you. And the hope, like, if it worked perfectly, that would make us protect us from danger, right? In that moment, um, if you're in a very scary situation and you respond by dissociating, which is something where you kind of almost like zone out. And we hear that a lot with like attacks or assaults, because your body can't really tolerate that, the stress. And so it just kind of removes itself a little bit. And so all of that, our bodies are, after trauma, we develop these adaptations to, and that's where there's like hypervigilance, which means you're like attuned to every kind of shift in the room, the person you're talking to, anything like that. Well, that's because at some point you had been hurt and learned that this is what I need to do to keep myself safe. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times without that being kind of managed and regulated, we become hyper vigilant, even when it wouldn't be very, even when it's not dangerous, right? And it's just our body's way of protecting us because there's been some kind of trigger or something to that effect.
I think unfortunately for us, it kind of speaks to the fact that our brains are like outdated software. I understand the function of it protecting us, but then it kind of comes out in all these other ways in adulthood as different kinds of behavioral issues and triggers and kind of going into fight or flight. Are there any obvious behaviors that you observe in patients that signify that they're dealing with trauma?
Yeah, definitely. There's flashbacks, which is when somebody is, they get some kind of triggered and they actually are almost reliving the experience. And you can kind of see when that's happening. It's almost like um, they're almost not there anymore, and because they're just in this whole other thing. Um, so that hypervigilance definitely we see very frequently. and nightmares. Also, just like, general anxiety and depression and stuff, those can definitely stem from trauma. Anxiety, that's a lot of times, hopefully, what the way we're hoping to use it is to prepare for all future threats. And so that doesn't have to be a result of trauma, but it definitely can be, because that's kind of what all these symptoms are. It's trying to protect us.
I want to switch gears to talking about how this shows up in relationships for people. Is trauma, unhealed trauma specifically, things that we're unaware of and just walking through the world with, is that leading people to pick the wrong partner?
Yeah, that's interesting. It is. Oftentimes, not always, of course, but the thing is, when we grow up in a chaotic environment, that's comfortable to us. And so we tend to, even if we know it's not healthy, even if we don't want to be in a chaotic environment, we do tend to gravitate towards that same kind of dynamic, just because it is comfortable. And people that grow up in a very chaotic household, it feels really uncomfortable having peace, right? Because it's just unusual, and or it was often followed by some kind of chaos as a child. And so it's there's that almost a negative association, like, what does this mean if nobody's, you know screaming or shouting? Does that mean it's going to happen, or something like that? So kind of being on edge.
You're working with a couple because I know you do a lot of marriage counseling. Are they pretty receptive if it's very obvious to you as the unbiased third party in the room that something is very toxic, whether it's kind of initiated from one person or maybe from both parties? Are they receptive to hearing that?
Yeah. So they usually are. If they're here, they want help and they're recognizing something's off, hopefully, and they maybe just can't put their finger on it. And so I help them kind of see that what you did as a child, um, that's still, like, that protected you as a child. And so if I was just working with somebody who was in a very dangerous situation growing up. And so they had to learn how to, like, shut off their emotions and actually become almost aggressive, right? That was how they protected themselves as a child. And they're still here today, so it worked. But unfortunately, when you get triggered, those behaviors, those childhood behaviors come out, because we have, like, our inner child inside of us goes, wait a second, I know how to protect us, right? I've been doing this since we were kids. And so it's okay, when there's a threat, we close our emotions off and we become angry, or we try to fix things. We try to make sure everything's okay, or we go and hide, run away, right? All of these different things. And so when those can kind of when I can connect those to childhood and see, and I really try to be intentional about, like, appreciating those behaviors, because they did keep that person safe and alive. But at the same time, like, while it served you very well as a child, it's not serving you in a relationship, because they are immature behaviors, they are childish behaviors, right? And so now we have the opportunity to learn some more productive behaviors, right? Asking for space instead of taking it, whatever it is. Set a boundary instead of people pleasing. So I think when people can really recognize that, and then also I try to highlight how this is impacting the relationship, I think a lot of times people feel kind of hopeful, like, oh, this makes sense. And now we can kind of work with it. But without identifying the trauma, it just seems confusing, right? Like, why am I doing this? Why is my partner doing this? I don't get it. But I think when you can kind of, like, understand it in that context, it makes it easier to receive that.
That's good because you're kind of doing it without ostracizing the person for their behaviors. I like the way that you phrased it, where you're kind of creating a softness around it of, I understand this is a behavior that protected you, and here you are. Let's zoom out and figure out how it's not serving you. Looking at a situation like that, if someone in an argument, especially in a romantic relationship, if they jump to anger, what should the person on the receiving end of that anger, how do they handle that? What's a good way to kind of de-escalate with a partner who jumps to anger?
So, you know, the the anger is covering up some kind of vulnerability. And so, depending on the circumstance, ideally, the person with the anger can kind of be able to identify that and take a break. Um, that takes a lot of practice, though. And so, I do a lot of like inner child exercises with clients. And so, I have them address that child that protects them. And I ask them, like, what does that child need to hear? And so maybe a child, like maybe somebody who has like some fears of abandonment, maybe they would tell their inner child, like, I'm not going to leave you, or something like that. And so that's really helpful information for their partner to have, because when their partner sees them dysregulated, like I said, that's that child kind of operating. And so they've got a clue at what might make the child feel better, right? I'm not going to leave you. So that can be helpful. Also, try if you can help identify what the anger is covering up. I mean, that can be really helpful because it can be hard to recognize when we feel so angry. And so, if I get really mad at my husband, and I say, you said we were going to go on a date and you didn't follow through, and I'm angry, maybe like that kind of sounds like I'm disappointed or hurt or something to that effect. And so that could be really helpful if in that anger my partner was able to say, it looks like you're really disappointed, and validate that. And even if they can't get there, just validating the anger, any kind of validation, will kind of lower your partner's guard and make it open, make you guys available to have a productive conversation. So I think any kind of validation can be helpful. Also, if you're able to identify what that underlying vulnerable emotion is, kind of asking your partner, could you be feeling disappointed right now? Or also, like, just getting curious, asking your partner more rather than what people typically do is tell you why you shouldn't be angry at them. Just like getting curious is like, can you tell me more about that? Or I see this is really, really upsetting to you. Tell me more. And I think those, anything but kind of resisting it or invalidating it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think a lack of validation with anything is probably at the root of so many different issues. On the flip side, like I'm a person who I'm a bit of an introvert. I definitely need space in conflict. If someone is similar to me and their kind of immediate physiological response is, oh, I need space, but you're dealing with a partner who maybe has abandonment issues. So I feel like the needing space is kind of even more fuel on the fire. What's a good way of handling that? How do you ask for the space without being like, hey, I'm not trying to disconnect from you right now. I'm not trying to reject your bid for connection, as the Gottmans would put it, but like, hey, I need some room.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's other than secured, that's the most common relationship dynamic, which is good because it's complementary. If you can learn how to work with it, right? Because if two people both avoided conflict, no one would ever get to the conflict. If and so those two can be complementary, and the key to that is taking a timeout. A timeout is different than abandoning, because you identify, I'm taking a timeout. You set a time, and then you come back after that time, and you have to follow through. Even if I say a good rule of thumb is about 2 hours to take a timeout. I wouldn't do less than that because you don't really, it takes that long to get regulated. Um, but I always say, like, the first few times you guys do this, the person who's afraid of abandonment, this is going to be very difficult for them to trust because likely in the past they haven't come back to it. Um, and so the person who needs the space, like the onus is really on them to follow through with that coming back. And after that happens a few times, the person with the anxious partner, which is the partner who has a fear of abandonment, they can start to relax a little bit and feel more comfortable giving their partner space because they know they're going to come back to it. During those times, I say do whatever you need to do to get regulated. But journaling can be helpful, or meditation, going for a walk, taking a nap, like whatever it takes to kind of calm yourself and soothe yourself, and be able to give your partner that space because it just won't work if you. That's usually what people do. They try to resist it, and or have that not happen. But in reality, that's an attachment style which is born or created in infancy. So instead of like resisting it, I think it's more practical to work with it. How can we do this and both of us not be hurt in the process? How can we both get our needs met in a more responsible way?
That's such a practical application. I really appreciate the 2-hour framework and the assurance to the anxious partner that you're gonna follow through and you're gonna come back. I mean, that's, like, very applicable. I wanted to ask, how can we be supportive or gain support? Because obviously, like, sexual assault is unfortunately a very common trauma. It's a big T trauma. 1 in 3 women have experienced it, and some men as well. How do you support a partner who has been through something like that?
Yeah, that is really difficult in relationships. And I mean, I think definitely as the partner, it's more of that like empathy and just under like trying to put yourself in their shoes and trying to be understanding and patient, for the partner who's experienced that. It's kind of their responsibility to verbalize to their partner, if possible, right, that I'm feeling overwhelmed right now or whatever they're noticing. But also, hopefully, the relationship, they've developed enough safety that they'll both feel comfortable kind of being vulnerable in whatever way that is, and developing trust in each other that this is a safe person to be with. And if I don't feel safe, I can tell my partner that and they'll respect it. In addition to that, of course, like trauma work for the partner who has experienced that. That could be in the presence of both partners, or it could be individual work. Um, but yeah, I think just more of that understanding, learning about trauma more, I think is always appreciated because I think sometimes it feels kind of like lonely, or people feel really kind of ashamed for how they respond, and that, they have these reactions. And so feeling like their partner, validates and can understand that this is a really scary, difficult thing that they've been through, and they're okay waiting and being patient on that. And so I think, yeah, no, like taking the pressure off, definitely, and being respectful, being open to hearing your partner, asking your partner what feels good, what's helpful. Sometimes we'll talk about, because somebody who's in a flashback, one person might want their partner to come and hold their hand when they noticing that. Another person might say, I don't want anyone near me. And so I think it's so important to be able to communicate to your partner, like what works for you when you're triggered, right? When you're having a panic attack, what helps? when you're having a flashback, because obviously the person who doesn't want to be touched, if they don't communicate that and their partner wants to comfort them, that that creates an unsafe situation. So I think the partner who's been assaulted to be able to verbalize what they need, and the other partner to ask, like, what works for you. I think a lot of times that we don't think about it. Like, we could just ask what works. A lot of times people just kind of keep guessing and trying things, when in reality, your partner might be able to tell you just exactly what they want.
Are there certain exercises that people who have an understanding of their trauma, they've recognized they have that's showing up in their behavior? What kinds of things can they do outside of counseling to work on it?
Mhm. Are you talking like in terms of having sex, that piece of it, if they've experienced a sexual assault?
Yeah, that or just any other trauma, I guess, if it's something that's really seeping into their day to day, they find themselves triggered a lot. They've gotten to the root of the cause and they're going to counseling. So they have that outside support as well. What can they do outside of counseling to help nurture that wound?
I think, like, I think journaling can be so helpful. Doing inner child work, especially if they're doing therapy, hopefully they've determined what the belief that has been caused is. And so keeping that kind of top of mind, sharing that belief with their partner, because then their partner has a clue. So if I go back to the ADHD example, if they develop the belief that I'm not good enough, their partner can they have an idea that when they get upset, they might be feeling like they're not good enough. And so being able to share that belief with your partner, so they kind of have an idea, especially when somebody's reaction doesn't seem to make obvious sense, that probably means that there's some kind of trauma being triggered. So I think like doing that work of, um, writing your inner child letters, going through those exercises, offering comfort, um, recognizing kind of all the ways that it shows up, which can be challenging, but really important, which is something. Trauma shows up in our body with sensations. Unfortunately, or as a result of that, people who have a lot of trauma, have a very difficult time often identifying what sensations they're feeling. And so sometimes I'll give people like a list of sensations and have them, anytime you walk by the list, pick out a sensation you're experiencing. And it can take a lot of work, but those are really good clues as to, once you're able to identify, oh, when I get a knot in my stomach, that usually means that I'm feeling overwhelmed, right? That's a really good clue, because it's our sensations that tell us what we're feeling. So I think being as aware of those things and being as open as possible to learning more about it, and when you keep the belief in mind, hopefully you can continue to challenge that belief. Um, is this true? Is there something really wrong with me? And kind of looking at that, instead of having it kind of live in our heads without us being able to clearly identify it with it, it just feels like this is just us. So once you can identify it, I think you can remove yourself hopefully a little bit from it and be able to work on it from almost more of an outside perspective.
So much of it seems to come back to having an awareness of what's going on in your body, which I think a lot of people spend a lot of time shutting down and not listening to, and it can be scary. So I think that's kind of where it's so frou-frou to always bring up meditation and be like, do it. But just as far as like actually tuning into your body and understanding what's wrong and like the knot in your stomach, you could just be like, I don't know, I feel crazy. What is it?
Yeah. Yeah. That's what meditation is, right? It's mindfulness, it's being aware, because exactly, we, even if, the sensations, but also just everything, people stay very busy so they don't have to, focus on things. We spend a lot of time and effort on not focusing on our feelings and sensations. And so I think that is why a lot of people don't like meditation, because we're saying to do the opposite, and it feels really uncomfortable. And a lot of people that have experienced, significant trauma, they have a hard time like being still and having quiet. And so meditation is asking you to do those things. And that's why it's meditation practice, because you're practicing a new skill.
Absolutely. So, at the beginning of a relationship, are there red flags that people are ignoring? How should it feel versus what we think it should feel like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first identifying like what what was my dynamic growing up, because we're just living in it as kids. We're not recognizing this is abnormal or this is different. And so if you can first identify what were some of the unhealthy dynamics, and then when you're in a relationship, if you're noticing a lot of those dynamics, then likely you're going back to that comfort rather than the maybe the more vulnerable piece of trying to be in a more secure, healthier relationship. So I think that's definitely a red flag. I think if it's normal to um, it's normal and important and smart to protect ourselves and not go around being vulnerable with everyone. Once you've developed a relationship, though, and you do feel secure, hopefully, if you still don't feel safe talking about things, I would say that's kind of a red flag. It doesn't mean it's not fixable. That's something you can come to therapy for, and or learn in some way. But I think, I mean, I guess that as probably a stereotypical therapist answer would be, if they're not willing to go to therapy, they're not willing to explore these patterns, if they defensiveness isn't um no one wants to be in a relationship with someone defensive, but also being open to, this is a adaptation this person developed for a reason, um, and it's something that needs to change. Like, it's valid, we understand, and it's not serving our relationship. So I think being open to um, making some improvements, being open to meeting your partner's needs, even if they don't make sense to you. So I guess those are more of the green flags. So, but yeah, I think just a resistance to understanding your partner more, I think would definitely be a red flag. Or if they feel kind of, uh, sometimes people will say, well, that's their thing to work on. They need to figure that out. When in reality, a relationship is two people. So even if one person is, communicating exactly like the textbook says, um, it it still needs to work with their partner. And so, it could be just exactly as we hope it could be, but it could still not be landing with their partner. So, understanding that a relationship is like a dynamic, it's a system. And so what, you know, one one partner kind of feeds off the other. It's a cycle. And so being able to see the cycle, or at least be aware of it, I think it's critical. And in order to do that, that requires accountability. So I would say definitely a resistance to even exploring any kind of those maladaptive behaviors. I think that would be, definitely a red flag.
That's a really good one. As far as, people should be doing their outside work on themselves, but coming together and doing something like couples counseling. Is there a point at which it's obvious that a couple needs counseling?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, the best is to get here before you get there,
Mhm.
but, I would say some of the big warning signs, or the big clues that therapy is probably indicated would be, um, people get to a point where they say everything is a fight. Like they can't talk about anything. Um, or when they talk about things, a bunch of different subjects come up because that's telling me that none of those are getting resolved. They're just getting like stacked and stacked and stacked until the next fight where they all come out and nothing gets resolved. Um, of course, if you're feeling resentful and it's resulting in you kind of pulling away from your partner, that would be a sign, I think, definitely to come to therapy and work through those resentments. Um, and I think, yeah, just, you know, when things just don't feel right or don't feel good, it doesn't have to be something big, but if it just kind of feels off or you don't feel as connected, um, I think that those are all good times to kind of start with couples therapy.
Have you seen a couple that kinda seemed like they were maybe headed towards divorce or it was really bad and been able to see them pull out of a nosedive?
Oh, yeah, like, frequently that happens, couples therapy works, I tell people, it really does, and so, yeah, a lot of times that it can just be something that they've never learned to hear their partner, they've never learned to validate their partner. I tell people all the time, like, if everyone could just learn how to validate, like, that will change your entire relationship. Um, I mean, immediately, I can have people I'm working with just screaming at each other, and they say, "This is how we are at home constantly." And, right when we can get one to validate the other and we can kinda walk through, their partner lets their walls down, and now we can have a productive conversation. But that's what fighting is. It's you're not hearing me, but you're not hearing me, but you're not hearing me, but you're not hearing me. And so once someone validates, it's like, oh, I don't have to fight anymore because you hear me, you know? So I think that is validation is kind of like that's the big picture in couples therapy. And once you can get that, that can change everything. And then empathy can also, kind of go along with that. And people have gone their entire relationship sometimes without being vulnerable. And so it never gets that deep. So I've had people that have been married for like 35 years and they've never been vulnerable with each other.
Wow.
And so there's not much keeping them close. And so people, once they learn vulnerability, I tell people, like, you can't recreate the honeymoon period, because that's not sustainable. That's like biology. But when you learn how to be vulnerable, you can maintain that really close, deep connection forever once you're able to communicate in that way. Instead of a lot of times when people have gotten in here, it's all the anger and none of the vulnerability.
I wanna switch gears a bit because I understand you work with EMDR. For someone who doesn't know what that is at all, how would you simply, I guess, explain it?
Yeah, it stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And so, what we do is when you experience a trauma, it gets stored in the wrong place in your brain. And so, with EMDR, we use eye movements and we um, first we desensitize, which means we kind of like take the charge out of that memory. And so, we can't erase a memory, but I try to explain it like it becomes a bad memory instead of a traumatic one, which means it's not like eliciting an emotional response. It's more of a damn that happened versus like you're kind of reliving it or getting, overwhelmed by it. So first we use the eye movements to desensitize, and then we use them to reprocess the trauma. So then we put it back in where it should go, and we address that belief that was developed by it. So the reprocessing would be hopefully taking that belief of I'm not good enough and turning it into something more realistic and believable. Hopefully, it would be I am good enough, but it could be whatever feels right for that person. So hopefully because like I said, the trauma is really that belief it causes inside of you. And so once we can desensitize that, the scary experience, we're able to work on that belief and hopefully change it to a more positive one.
What's something you know about EMDR that you wish everybody knew?
Um, that it works really well. It's, I think a lot of people when they hear it, if they're not super familiar with it, I think it sounds kind of like, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. We're using eye movements, but it is evidence based. It's one of the most preferred treatments to process trauma. But yeah, I think I wish more people knew that it's an option and it really can work and it can really be life changing. It in talking about trauma that doesn't process trauma, but talking about it is incredibly painful. Unfortunately, with EMDR, you don't have to talk about it much, and so I think it's a little bit more appealing in that way. And, relative compared to some other options, it's relatively quick, depending on circumstances. But yeah, I would say it's one of the less painful types of therapy.
What does the protocol look like? And on average, how long does it take to get over like one trauma?
So there's so much that goes into it, but the protocol is we first do a background. I determine attachment style because that impacts it. Um, I, of course, assess for what are the current symptoms, what are the current triggers, what's the desired state, what do they want to get out of this, how do they want to be. Um, and then so once we identify what we'd like to work on, we have to go back to the earliest memory of that belief. And so if somebody talks about an incident when, they were in their teens and that resulted in them feeling like I'm not lovable, well, that was just reinforced likely in that older teenage years that developed somewhere in childhood. Um, and so we go back and like, when did this develop? And that would be the first, we call it target. That would be the first thing that we desensitize because we can't change the current belief by only working on the current scenario or the most recent one. We've got to go all the way back to like the root of it before we can even make any progress on the more recent experiences. Does that part make sense?
It does, yeah, because I think the trouble sometimes, because I have a friend who did this and she wasn't sure if it was working or not. The thing that she was bumping into a lot during the sessions was the inability to remember like the first instance. And I think with a lot of us, right, it's like, how many memories do you have under the age of 5 when maybe that seed was planted?
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people do that. The thing is, it doesn't actually have to be the first time it happened.
Okay.
It has to be what you remember because that's what we're kind of working off of. Those memories do live inside of us even from before we can remember, but we can't access those, so we go with what we can. And like I said, that is kind of what you're operating off of, that memory. You're not consciously thinking it, but and so that's kind of what we can still work with that hopefully. even though it's not the very first time, because that is kind of unrealistic to have everyone remember when was the first time this belief was even created inside of you. Instead, we just work with what what they're going off of.
Is it effective to do remotely or do you have to be in person?
No, remotely. There's all different ways to do it. Sometimes people tap. They like will tap their arms. Um, when I do it remotely, I usually use a program, and it's like a ball on the screen, and the person has to make it full screen on their computer, and their eyes just follow the ball, and I can control the speed depending on what stage of the process we're in. The speeds change a little bit, but yeah, it's totally doable virtually.
What is it that's happening in our brains during that? Like, why does moving your eyes back and forth have the impact of healing something?
Mhm. So even though it's called or EMDR eye movements, what it really is bilateral stimulation, which just means like right to left. Um, Eye movements are the more common that we do, but that's also why like tapping works. Sometimes people will hold buzzers in each hand. Um, and in doing that left to right movement, somehow that works. That moves that memory to where it should be. So it's not necessarily the eye movements. It's more, I think it's like more of the connecting the different parts of the brain and having them kind of work together. So, because again, that trauma is stored in the wrong part. And so doing that kind of helps it, I think, move back to the where we want it to be.
And after, let's say, however many sessions it takes to really get through something like that, how can you, as the practitioner, tell that it's worked for a patient?
Yeah, that we check in with it's called the SUD, subjective unit of disturbance. And so I keep asking them on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 is no disturbance, 10 is the highest you can imagine. How disturbing does the incident feel to you now? Ideally, the number's going down, down, down until we get to a 0. And so it's just a very, I mean, kind of direct measure. It's just checking in with that scale. And that's pretty, that kind of gives me most of the information I need.
And what kinds of patients are you saying? Do they need to have like a little bit of a history of doing different healing modalities, or can they just jump right into EMDR?
No, they can just jump right in. That was another part of the process. So before we do the desensitization, we do something called resourcing. So we kind of do a lot of like preparation work so that the client can stay present and grounded, and not a risk is that a client might dissociate during EMDR. And so we try to prepare as much as possible to prevent that. And so that we'll do some kind of some bilateral stimulation on far less disturbing incidents, but just to build that like belief that this is helpful, this is safe, we can kind of do this. But yeah, also the just grounding, all these different mindfulness, I guess, exercises can help stay present. I forget the question.
I want to ask, what's like the worst, I guess, memory or trauma that you've seen it be effective on diluting?
Um, let's see. I mean, childhood trauma like CPTSD, which is ongoing trauma. As a child, it was like abuse usually. That is so like pervasive, and I mean it's complex trauma. There's it is complex, and that really shapes kind of so much in somebody. And so EMDR can be really um, effective at working with that. And so, I mean, those could be incredibly, depending. whatever the level of abuse was. But yeah, I think it's just definitely, I think that's kind of a longer process because it is so complex. But like some single incident traumas, I mean, I've seen it work on pretty horrific incidences while in combat that people have had, um, assaults, definitely. Um, Again, it's not necessarily that how big the trauma was. It's it's the belief that it created
Mm,
inside of you. And so that that's making progress is changing that belief. And so it could be something that seems very small to somebody else, but it created this huge belief that impacts them everywhere. Um, or it could be the opposite, you know? And so it's not necessarily what the incident is. It's more just targeting the belief.
that's a lovely way of looking at it. Kayla Crane, if people want to learn more and work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, my website is just southdembertherapy.com, and same for my Facebook, Instagram, just at South Denver Therapy.
Amazing. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.